Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're looking at an absolutely incredible underdog story. When we think about comics globally right now, Korean digital webtoons are a total powerhouse. But the journey of Korean comics, which are known as manhwa, wasn't just some smooth, easy climb to the top of the entertainment industry. Instead, it's a really fascinating tale of art surviving and constantly adapting to a deeply turbulent 20th century. We're going to explore how artists pushed back against colonialism, war, military dictatorships, and even total economic collapse, using nothing but ink, paper, and just immense resilience. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is the chronological roadmap we're going to use to explore how intense historical shifts forced these artists to pivot. We'll start with the birth, satire, and propaganda, then look at war and the manhwa, the dark age of censorship, bizarre 70s anti-communist comics, the 1980s manhwa renaissance, and finally the 1990s crisis and evolution. So, Korea's 20th century was defined by massive upheaval. We're talking Japanese colonialism, a devastating civil war, decades of military rule, and then a pretty rocky road to democratization paired with a huge financial crash. The absolutely crucial thing to keep in mind here is this. Every single macro shift in governance directly hammered the micro world of manhwa. These artists were never just creating in a vacuum. They were constantly reacting to the world shifting right beneath their feet. Section 1. Birth, Satire, and Propaganda. So this right here is literally day one of manhwa. It's a 1909 satirical cartoon by Lee Do-young, which was published right on the front page of the Daehan Munbo newspaper. It was specifically designed to satirize current events and really arouse patriotism. But as you might guess, that creative freedom was incredibly short-lived. Once the Japanese occupied the Korean peninsula, they aggressively suppressed Korean media. Satirical comics just like this one were quickly repressed and essentially wiped out by the late 1920s. With independent Korean newspapers completely shut down, the occupying government actually weaponized the comic medium for their own propaganda. They started producing cartoons specifically depicting Koreans as unmodernized and ignorant. For example, you'd see a Korean man looking totally shocked because he doesn't know what a car is, or looking completely confused trying to board a tram. The occupying authorities basically used manhwa to mock the local population and justify their assimilation policies. They were pushing young people toward war and farmers toward producing more rice for the army. So very quickly, manhwa had become a tool of the state. Section 2. War and the manhwa. Out of the rubble of the Korean War came what's known as dokji manhwa. Because of severe raw material shortages at the time, publishers printed these shoddy, thin, 16-page comic booklets on incredibly low-quality paper. But you have to imagine, for war-devastated children, these were pure magic. They were just filled with fantasy and adventure. To afford them, kids would flock to these dedicated rental shops called manhwa. You'd pay a flat hourly rate and just sit there reading towering stacks of these cheap, thrilling booklets. And that setup created a massive, immediate demand for content. But, and this brilliantly illustrates the problem, that massive demand had a pretty dark side. Distributors and rental shops needed more and more comics, and local artists simply couldn't draw fast enough to keep up. Desperate, they resorted to blatant plagiarism. You'd have the popular Japanese manga, like Kenya Boy, and then you'd see the 1952 Korean pirated version retitled The King of the Jungle. Publishers were literally hiring amateur artists to just trace over imported Japanese manga. This created a widespread culture of piracy that would honestly haunt the industry's reputation for decades. Section 3. The Dark Age of Censorship. Moving into the 1960s, under a new military regime, comics were suddenly viewed as a threat to public order. The pre-censorship rules they put in place were completely suffocating and, frankly, almost comical in their absurdity. You couldn't have a talking animal as a main character. Swords and knives, completely banned. Artists had to literally draw characters fighting with brooms and clubs instead. If a fight did break out, it couldn't last more than 3 pages. And my personal favorite rule, a fist was strictly forbidden from making contact with an opponent's face. As you can imagine, this basically eliminated entire genres like sports, boxing, and fantasy right out of the gate, severely limiting what creators could actually do. Section 4. Bizarre 70s Anti-Communist Comics. So, going into the 1970s, you had two completely opposing cultural forces coexisting. On one hand, the state ideology demanded strict ethical stoicism, traditional Confucian principles, and all-out national security, really clamping down on anything considered obscene. But on the other hand, Popular culture was experiencing an absolute explosion of hyper-violent adult comics and voyeuristic films. So the big question is, how on earth did artists bypass the strict government censors to publish all this sensationalized mature content? Well, they found a brilliant, utterly bizarre loophole: Bangang Sangin Manhwa, or anti-communist adult comic books. Publishers realized that the government censors would completely turn a blind eye to explicit violence and highly sexualized content, stuff often labeled as junk or lewd comics, as long as the story explicitly served an anti-communist message. So artists foregrounded incredible violence and sadism simply by making the villains North Korean communists. By claiming to dramatize the cruel realities of communism, they were able to feed readers' desires for thrilling, mature content right under the censors' noses. It's wild. Section 5. The 1980s Manhwa Renaissance. Finally, in the 80s, the ridiculous censorship rules of the 60s and 70s faded. Suddenly, animals could talk again. This gave rise to absolute classics like Dooley the Little Dinosaur. But on a deeper level, the public, who were still living under military rule, really craves stories of overcoming intense adversity. This era saw the rise of epic underdog dramatic comics, like Lee Hinsei's The Terrifying Mercenary Baseball Team, which followed a group of absolute losers who endure brutal training to become champions. It perfectly captured the resilience of the Korean people at the time. This era also saw the incredible emergence of female-driven comics known as sunjeong. Instead of just cheap thrills, female artists like Hwang Mina and Shin Il-suk really expanded the depth of the medium. They created these complex, emotionally rich romantic sagas, often based on historical events. And structurally, the whole industry matured. It transitioned away from just those cheap, smoke-filled rental shops and into high-quality, serialized print magazines. A huge milestone was the launch of Renaissance magazine in 1988. Manhwa was finally becoming a respected literary art form. Section 6. The 1990s Crisis and Evolution. But the 90s brought massive challenges. First, the Korean government finally lifted the long-standing ban on importing Japanese cultural products. Almost overnight, the market was absolutely flooded with officially licensed Japanese heavyweights like Dragon Ball and Slam Dunk. Because Korean publishers had spent decades relying on unoriginal tropes or outright piracy to keep up with rental shop demand, many local artists simply couldn't compete with the massive budgets and the highly polished storytelling of the Japanese manga machine. The local industry hit a massive slump. And then came 1997. The IMF Asian financial crisis hit South Korea like a sledgehammer. The national economy just crashed, and the exchange rate plummeted. For the print manhwa industry, this was a total death sentence. The cost of importing paper, pulp, and ink literally doubled. Publishers were already losing their readership to Japanese manga, and now they physically couldn't afford to print physical books anymore. The traditional print manhwa industry as they knew it essentially died right here. So, backed into a corner by that 1997 economic crash, publishers couldn't afford paper or ink. But what does that mean for the artists? When you can't afford to print on paper, where else is there left to draw? Well, with the government aggressively pushing early internet infrastructure, desperate artists took the absolutely only path left. They started scanning their comics and uploading them online for free. By adapting to absolute economic disaster, they unwittingly gave birth to the vertical scrolling, digital webtoon phenomenon that completely dominates the globe today. So, the next time you scroll through a glossy digital comic on your phone, you have to ask yourself, would this multi-billion-dollar modern industry even exist today if a whole generation of Korean artists hadn't been backed into a corner with absolutely no paper left to draw on? It's a pretty amazing thought.